why would you send 100 labor activists to interfere in an election and support one particular party when you don't know the outcome? Why would you send Morgan McSweeney to go down to Mar-a-Lago and interface with the Trump transition? Why would you appoint Peter Mandelson? Again, I mean, the only thing worse I can think than appointing Peter Mandelson would be maybe reappoint Kim Dara to come back to Washington, or now Sadiq Khan. I mean, really.
I want to ask about your proposal to impose tariffs on Great Britain from the United States. Do you think this is something President Trump should be looking at?
I think we need to actually talk about what we're actually talking about here. And with regards to the United States president, he has authority over 301, 201, and 232 tariffs. And these are tools in the president's toolbox that he can use without checks from Congress or anyone else. He discovered this in his first term, and he certainly employed them, particularly against the People's Republic of China, and in cases where there were unfair practices. But he also has used them and proposed them, most recently, in cases that do not involve trade policy or the economics. For example, when he made his tweet about Canada, the 25% tariff threat against Canada and Mexico, he basically referenced border control and the fentanyl crisis. And what was the result? Immediately, Justin Trudeau, he got a plane, he went down to Mar-a-Lago, dined with Howard Lutnick on one side, Trump on the other, and then Trudeau went, of course, back to Canada and promised to spend $1.3 billion extra on defense. With regards to Mexico, President Sheinbaum is now talking about the potential of processing illegal migrants through Mexico. So he makes if you read The Art of the Deal, a lot of it's about the messaging. You create a lot of, you make a very robust statement. You bring people around the table, and they negotiate. So part of the process is just announcing the proposed tariff, and then that generally leads to something. And of course, tariffs, as Eric Trump said recently on GB News, tariffs are in response to something. With regards to the United Kingdom, we have a new government that has, certainly has a lot of policies and values and proposals that are at variance with the incoming Trump administration. And of course, you've had people such as Bill Ackman, who's put out a tweet stating that the U.S. should suffer economic sanction over the alleged cover-up of the grooming gangs, the grooming gang rape of innocent British girls. You've also had not just the United Kingdom singled out, but for example, you had J.D. Vance, who earlier had called out the Irish Justice Minister for their hate speech bill, which basically he saw as a question of censorship. And suggested that there could be sanctions for that. So we're talking about using the tools that there's lots of different kinds of tariffs. Keep in mind, we're talking about 301, 201, and 232 tariffs that are tools of the president's toolbox that he can use in areas well beyond trade policy.
So in your view, should the Trump administration be putting pressure on Starmer's government to open a grooming gangs inquiry using tariffs?
Well, again, I think that we have to also dial back what we're actually talking about with regards to tariffs. So it can be argued that tariffs and taxes do not make any country richer because they inherently subtract from the circular flow of income and production that measures GDP. And the relevant question is whether tariffs will make America less poor than some other tax, and whether the excess burden or collateral damage from a tariff is less than it would be with another tax that raises an equivalent amount of revenue. And so the answer is it depends. And so that, of course, is the economic discussion. But what we're talking about here, since Trump has been elected, these tariff announcements against the European Union, saying tariffs unless they purchase more American fuel, energy, with regards to the 25% tariff against Canada and Mexico, the threat of tariffs against the BRIC countries if they leave the U.S. currency and try to form their own currency and try to form a new world reserve currency that would be obviously a currency that's dominated by China. Those are taking the tariff, threat of the tariff as a sanction and weaponizing it in areas that go well beyond trade policy. So I think that the new Labour government, to answer your question, I'm going to leave that to the president and his team to talk about if they want to actually impose tariffs on the United Kingdom. I would say that they've been somewhat amateurish in their approach so far, in the sense that can Keir Starmer find someone in his cabinet to interface with the incoming Trump administration that hasn't called President Trump a Nazi or some other defamatory word, because he's not a Nazi. And I think that their student politics days have come back to bite them. And I think some of them are still behaving like student politicians. I think it was incredibly foolish to send Morgan McSweeney down to Mar-a-Lago to interface with the Trump administration, given that this person had actually gone to the Democratic National Convention and cheered on Kamala Harris. That's just a stupid decision. And one has to start asking the question, are they trying to offend the Trump administration? Are they trying to kill the special relationship between the United Kingdom and the US? Or are they just incredibly stupid? Are they just incompetent, or are they just so unused to holding power again? Because I remember when I was on the civil service fast stream working in the Tony Blair's under Tony Blair's government at the time as a career civil servant, we may not agree with the policies of the Blair government, the Brown government, but they certainly had a lot of very capable and able people. And I'm not seeing that level of, acumen and ability coming from the new crowd that have come in. Having a foreign secretary that has said the sort of things that David Lammy has said about President Trump, I think perhaps that was a poor choice of foreign secretary. So I think actually talking about whether or not they'll be tariffed, I will say this. When I've actually been talking to people in Congress and the Senate, senators and congressmen, about, for example, the potential for UK-US free trade agreements, one of the things I'm consistently getting back in response from Americans right over there in the Capitol, where I'm in Washington, American allies and adversaries should take note that strong leadership is returning, and policies such as censorship of free speech or support of Hamas, the vilification of the state of Israel, the upholding the ICC arrest warrant of the former Israeli defense minister and Prime Minister Netanyahu, could meet a harsh U.S. response in the form of tariffs. And as I've said, J.D. Vance has suggested economic sanctions against Ireland over its proposed hate speech law. And as I've said, when I present the arguments for a UK-US free trade agreement and the benefits for both countries, the United Kingdom and the US, to senators, House members, and congressional staff, they have responded with policy concerns over, police arrests and prison sentences over Facebook posts in the UK, as well as the British police threats to extradite US citizens over social media posts. So again, I think that you would think that they would perhaps want to dial some of that back now that President Trump is coming into office. Indeed, the issue has recently been addressed by Elon Musk and a recent Senate Judiciary Committee hearing. Trade policy now extends well beyond economic considerations and can be used to address other policies that relate to American values and the sorts of countries with whom we want free trade with. Trade policy is now not just about commerce, but it's also about values.
The Labour Party also sent out 100 staffers, more than 100 staffers, to campaign for Kamala Harris during the election campaign. Have you heard Republican politicians complaining about this to you in relation to your discussions around a US-UK free trade agreement?
Yes, I have, and it's actually, I should say, Stephen, it's not just the Labour Party that did this. You had, for example, Robert Buckland, the Tory, former Tory Justice Minister under the previous government, endorsed Kamala Harris. I was looking at, for example, my Instagram and Twitter feeds on election night here in Washington, and I saw all these conservatives endorsing Kamala Harris. So I don't think there's a great deal of love between the Trump transition and the Conservative Party and the Labour Party. It was truly horrific that these 100 Labour activists were sent to the United States to campaign for Kamala Harris. It is interfering in a domestic U.S. election. And again, Morgan McSweeney went to the Democratic National Convention and cheered on Kamala Harris. And then to choose that person to go down to Mar-a-Lago interface with the Trump transition, I thought was monumentally foolish. So yes, these things are noticed. And for example, the Irish TSOC, the Irish Prime Minister Harris, he actually put out a tweet endorsing Kamala Harris as well. And the last time I checked, that tweet had not been deleted. These things are noticed. And I think whether it's the Irish government that's still perhaps living in a world where they think that Bill Clinton is still president and he's not, or the Labour Party coming to grips with the fact that they need to graduate from being student politicians. They need to recognize the fact that there's a new sheriff in town and there's strong leadership back on the world stage. We've been in a crisis of leadership for a while now. We've had very weak leadership under President Biden. I say that as someone who used to work for a Democrat member of Congress. I've seen very strong Democratic leadership in the past, but we had particularly weak leadership under President Biden. He was obviously not mentally capable and in certainly health decline, and that was obvious for most of the American public. And we have strong leadership returning to the White House. And I think that it would behoove our allies to take note. And we also need to take note of what sort of allies we want to, share strong economic and cultural and economic trade ties with. Countries that share our values. And arresting people, letting hardened criminals, pedophiles out of prison, and putting people in prison over Facebook posts and giving them harsher, sentences in prison. I think that is I'm getting a lot of messages from people just in that building over there, the U.S. Congressional and Senate buildings, expressing serious concern about that. And yes, trade policy, that will involve trade policy now. There are tools in the president's toolbox that he can use to address these things. And it certainly is up to President Trump's administration whether or not they want to use those in the way that they've certainly used them against Canada and Mexico recently, which have, of course, borne fruit. And Canada and Mexico have adhered to President Trump's concerns.
And what about this Chagos Islands deal? Now, this is a deal, for people who don't know, where basically the Labour Party, the British government, have decided to hand over billions of pounds of taxpayer money to Mauritius in order to maintain some kind of sovereignty over islands we already own. And there are people who are saying, Trump's team Trump could veto the deal. Senator John Kennedy today was already tweeting about this, saying that Trump should veto it, and he's raised his concerns that Labour are rushing through the deal. They may have even offered various concessions to Mauritius, giving, front-loading the payments and other concessions to get the deal through before Trump is inaugurated. What's your view on this deal? Is this another issue that's coming up in Congress?
Well, I think there are a lot of issues there that go well beyond just what you said. For example, the genesis of that negotiation to hand that back actually happened under James Cleverly. So again, a lot of these problems Labour did actually inherit from the previous so-called Conservative government. And I actually want to just touch on that issue for a moment. The UK's had pretty bad leadership for a long time. And I think people, when Labour came into power, people were expecting them to fix all these problems overnight. You have to understand that David Cameron turned the Conservative Party into a social democratic woke party. And as someone who actually worked as a civil servant in the United Kingdom at the Ministry of Defence when Blair and Brown were prime ministers, I actually found the successive Conservative governments to be actually further to the left on many issues, particularly cultural issues, particularly the whole issues of DEI and ESG, which became the new religions of the United Kingdom under the Conservatives. The fact that the Conservative Party no longer is a Thatcherite or even, I would call it, a capitalist party. They're a party that is about punitive taxation. They're a party about the increased regulation after the United Kingdom left the European Union, and it's a government by regulation. The United Kingdom is overtaxed, overgoverned, whilst the Tories were in power. Those are not Thatcherite principles. They're not a Conservative party. So again, I think we need to look where the genesis of this is. So if you look at the Chagos deal, that was actually started under James Cleverly, someone who quite frankly was known in the civil service when I was there as, what should I say, what should I do? That's what he would ask civil servants. He's not someone, he was basically a mouthpiece. He wasn't someone who was really, in charge of his brief. And so I can say that as someone, that was what he was known for. That's what people called him. What should I say? What should I do? He was pretty much spoon-fed what he was supposed to say and do by officials. So that started under him, and then, of course, the Labour Party carried it out coming into office. I think that there was some Labour has been out of power for a long time. There's not a lot of people who served in the previous Blair and Brown governments in cabinet. You have great people like Douglas Alexander, but you've got a lot of novices there as well. And, of course, if you look at the actual Chagos deal, I don't see any strong argument why. I've never understood why this other, island country that is so very, very far away, has some sort of claim on it. Also, given that that country, of course, is basically a satellite of the People's Republic of China. So there's strong security concerns giving that sovereignty to such a country, when, of course, it's not just a question of UK sovereignty, it's also a question of an American military base there. So again, I don't think there were adequate considerations. And people say, oh, yes, President Biden was for it. Well, President Biden isn't exactly been the best friend of the United Kingdom. Although he's actually 70% English, he's 30% Irish, and he totally and wholly identifies with his Irish background and has a particular historical narrative and hasn't been terribly keen on British interests. So I think he was perhaps, of course, if you look at the way he's handled the withdrawal of Afghanistan and all sorts of other national security and foreign policy issues when he was president or didn't handle them, quite frankly, you could just put that down to another one of his failures. I think they should have waited until President Trump, or at least wait until after the election to do that. I think that the timing was wrong. I think also that there was the premise for it was wrong. So I think there's a lot of factors we need to re-examine that decision. I do hope that it can be reversed, and I know that definitely is the interest of the incoming Trump administration.
Why does the British government seem insistent on appointing ambassadors who despise President Trump? We can talk about Kim Darroch. We can talk about Karen Pierce, who is incredibly woke. She's the current ambassador. She stands with drag queens. She goes to various pride parades and so on. And now they're appointing Peter Mandelson, who, as you said earlier, has made some very, very extreme comments, negative comments about Donald Trump. What's going on here?
Well, that's quite a loaded question. So let me just unpack that, if I may. First of all, with regards to Kim Darroch, it's my understanding that it was actually Theresa May who actually said she found President Trump such a threat to the international rules-based system, and she encouraged Kim Darroch to do whatever he could to undermine President Trump and his administration. Not only that, we have to remember it was actually Kim Darroch who validated and stood for the efficacy of the Christopher Steele dossier, which we now know was just a fabrication in a tissue of lies. It's been totally proven to be bogus. So again, this is someone who actually was, promoting the Steele dossier internally and externally whilst he was here in Washington, and also whilst he was here, as we know from the press, and that he was, of course, giving U.S. state secrets from his Five Eyes briefing to a CNN journalist in exchange for sexual favors. And of course, Trump effectively sacked him. He also compared President Trump to Arnold Schwarzenegger in a very, very tabloid-esque memo that he wrote. So again, that's a pretty poor example. So I think, we don't want to go back to a situation where relations were so low at that time between our two countries. The only time it was worse was, of course, with the Cambridge spies, the British Embassy, in the 1950s. Then if you fast forward to the recent announcement, again, the first we heard about the announcement actually taking place, and there were concerns raised about Peter Mandelson before, was when it was tweeted out, when the announcement went out. And I think there are some concerns with regards to China. I mean, I here at the Heritage Foundation hosted for a meeting the vice president of Shein, who told me, and also told members of Congress as well, he said, last year we had 20% Uyghur forced labor in our supply chains, and our independent auditors have now told us that it's down to 8%. And I said, that's 8% too much. That's not a success. Can you imagine if some American CEO were to say, oh, my company has gone down from 20 to 8% forced labor in our supply chain. So again, this is a company, Shein, who tried listing on the New York Stock Exchange. And then obviously there were concerns raised about that. So they've gone over to the London Stock Exchange. And the lobbying firm that has lobbied on their behalf, on Shein's behalf, has been, of course, Peter Mandelson. So again, that raises some very serious national security concerns for the United States. And it shows us, and given Kim Darroch's behavior with U.S. intelligence when he was here, I think you can see a situation where there'll be a holding back of sharing intelligence with Peter Mandelson and some concerns raised. And of course, the Trump administration, and certainly President Trump, remembers the way Kim Darroch behaved. And we certainly don't want a repeat of that. And again, I go back to what I said earlier. Can this Labour government find someone? Do they know anyone that hasn't put out a tweet or said something defamatory about President Trump? It cannot be that difficult. They can't all be student politicians. There must be someone, and there are. There are people like Douglas Alexander. There are people who served in the administrations of Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. So I think that there things can be done differently, but I think there have been some pretty poor choices and, quite frankly, foolish ones. Again, just why would you send 100 labor activists to interfere in an election and support one particular party when you don't know the outcome? Why would you send Morgan McSweeney to go down to Mar-a-Lago and interface with the Trump transition? Why would you appoint Peter Mandelson? Again, I mean, the only thing worse I can think than appointing Peter Mandelson would be maybe reappoint Kim Dar to come back to Washington, or now Sadiq Khan. I mean, really, that was actually what someone in the Trump transition told me. They said, if they pull back Peter Mandelson, what would come next? Are they going to send, Sadiq Khan here? It could get worse. I mean, I think they need to start upping their game and start being more careful about the decisions they've made. And perhaps they should send some seasoned diplomat, career diplomat down to Mar-a-Lago to interface with Trump and his people. Just some, homespun advice for you. I mean, it's not rocket science. This is not rocket science. These are basics.
Yeah, and this is a Tory and a Labour problem. You've covered that very well. Thank you so much, Andrew, for joining us. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you very much, Steve. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for watching this video. If you want to watch more content, please subscribe to our new GBN America YouTube channel. Thank you so much for watching GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.